I won't be long. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Ambassador James Zumwalt, who was and still is actually one of our foremost experts on East Asia. In the interest of full disclosure, I have to say that Jim is an old friend, and his wife, Anne, who's with us as well and was a diplomat as well, is here and is an old friend. Welcome, Anne, too. I first met Jim 30 years ago in Yokohama when I was with his wife, actually, studying advanced Japanese. Jim was also in Yokohama, but he didn't need the Japanese. He already was advanced, and he's been advanced, more advanced than I have been all my life. He got his Japanese the honest way. He spent part of his high school year, in fact, one whole year in high school, as an exchange student in Tokyo. Went back at university level, studied a couple years, served 4 times in the Foreign Service. So all added up, it was 17 years of his life that he spent in Japan, actually communicating with people. He had loads of contacts, and he got to know the culture profoundly, I would say. So adding to that, on East Asia, he and Anne both served in Beijing a couple of years, learned Chinese for that. Back in the department, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia. Again, included in that is Korea. So he's developed an expertise over the years that is really unparred in some ways. It's unchallenged by almost anyone I can think of from my career. I think that's probably enough said from my side. Jim, why don't you come up and give him the real story? Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you all. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. It's really gratifying for me to see the tremendous interest in foreign affairs that we can find in Traverse City. When Stan called me and asked if I would come and speak here, and he told me I would find a very engaged and audience, and so I'm very much looking forward to your questions, and I'll try and keep my remarks perhaps to about 40 minutes so we can have time for questions and answers, because I think that's very important. But what I wanted to talk about today, and this is my first slide, is U.S.-Japan relations. And if you take away one thing from today's talk, what I hope you'll take away is that the phrase I use is a natural partnership. It sounds a little strange, and I'm going to explain what that means. But it's something that's, for me, it's obvious and natural that the United States and Japan would have such a strong and mutually beneficial relationship. And the reason is that our relationship is based upon shared values and shared interests. And that's perhaps unique among our relationships with other Asian countries. And so because of these shared values and shared interests, Japan really is a natural partner for the United States. And what do I mean by shared values? Japan is a democracy like the United States. Japanese people enjoy freedom of expression, freedom of religion. They are a country of rule of law. They desire to attain peaceful solutions to resolve international conflicts. And we also share a very similar rules-based economic system that really depends on an open international economic system. So for that reason, we really are quite tremendous natural partners because of these shared values. One other reason why Japan is important for the United States is because Asia is important to the United States. And this map, I think, illustrates that point. This, of course, is not a map that is showing countries in terms of the size of their territory, but rather the size of their populations. And so if you look at this map here, half of the world is Asia. So if the United States is interested in being an international presence in the world, it's important for us not to ignore the half of the world that's Asia. And Japan, of course, can really help us engage with Asia. So let me talk a little bit now about the role of United States in the Asia Pacific, and I think that will help explain why Japan is so important, why Japan is such an important partner for the United States. And if we posit that we're interested in engaging in Asia and we're looking for partners in Asia, we want to find partners who are themselves influential and able to work together with us. And if you look at that, This slide, I think, illustrates that, but Japan is a very powerful and influential partner. There's a very good think tank in Australia called Lowy Institute, which is in Melbourne, Australia, and they have a very interesting study. You can go on to their website and see this for yourself, but they have what they call an Asia Power Index, and they look at 288 different indicators and assess what is the power of that country in Asia. They look at 25 different countries. And for the last 2 years, they started this 2 years ago, Japan has ranked number 3 out of the 25 countries they assess as a country with influence in the region. Number 1 is the United States, number 2 is China, and number 3 is Japan. And in particular, Japan got very high marks for its diplomatic influence. It was number 2 in the region. Economic resources, cultural influence, and economic relationships, Japan ranked very well. So if we're looking for a strong and influential partner, it makes sense for us to look to Japan as one of those most important partners. But another reason Japan is so important, you may laugh at Hello Kitty, but have you heard of the concept soft power? Are you familiar with that concept? This is a concept that Joe Nye, a professor at Harvard, devised to say that, you know, a country's influence is not only its military strength, that's hard power, but the ability of a country to attract friends and to attract is what he called soft power. And this is the power of culture and the power of your ideals. And Japan ranks very well as very strong in the area of soft power. I put up here Hello Kitty and Gudetama, the lazy egg, as 2 Japanese symbols that are very strong and influential in Asia. But this survey is something that's done by University of Southern California, ranking countries in the world based on their soft power, the power of their culture to attract. Of course, for the United States, this is things like Disneyland and National Basketball Association and those kinds of things that people are interested in. They want to come to the United States because of these Hollywood movies. These are all kinds of things. But Japan has consistently risen in the ranking until today. It's number 5 in the world in terms of its soft power, according to this soft power index. And the reason this Japan has done so well, they just surpassed Canada as number 5, is because of Japan's reputation for having quality products, precision engineering, being a safe country. People admire their democratic ideals. So Japan is very strong in the area of soft power. So therefore, Japan is a good choice for us as a strong and influential partner. And now I'd like to look a little bit at the Asia-Pacific region. And as you all know, but particularly in East Asia, the big challenge right now is the rise and emergence and growing strength of China. And what does that mean for other countries in the region? And if you look at this map, I think it's fairly clear to see that China is essentially a continental power. China has borders, land borders with 14 countries. You know, we have land borders with 2 countries. And China, although there's aspirations to become a maritime power, they have a geographic problem, and that is that China does not have open and unfettered access to the ocean. If you look at a map of the United States, I don't have one up here, but you can, I'm from San Diego, and you can sail from San Diego out, and there's no island or other country blocking your way. You're in the Pacific as soon as you leave the port of San Diego. Similarly, if you're in Boston or New York or Philadelphia, you leave the port and you're in the Atlantic Ocean. China doesn't have that luxury. All of their seaports are hemmed in by what they call the first island chain and the second island chain. And they see these island chains as barriers to their desire to be a maritime power. And of course, if you look at the north of those 2 island chains, it's Japan that is partly blocking Chinese access to the Pacific Ocean. So there's a natural tension that's evolved, a geographic tension, if you will, between Japan and China. And now, if you look at Japan, it's exactly the opposite. Japan really is a maritime nation. They have thousands of islands. Japan has the 6th largest maritime economic zone of any country in the world because of this chain of islands they have. The amount of their economic zone surpasses their landmass very much. And so Japan is a very natural maritime power. So this is, one of the key contrasts between Japan and China in the region, and one reason why for the United States, because we're also a maritime power in the Pacific, it's so important for us to work together with another maritime power such as Japan. So now let me turn. I've talked about the importance of the Asia-Pacific region and why, if we want to be engaged in Asia, it's important for us to choose a partner like Japan to work with together because we have shared values and also shared interests. So now let me turn a little bit and talk about our security partnership. One of the characteristics, actually, of our relationship recently has been the close personal relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe. Prime Minister Abe has really worked hard to develop his personal relationship with our president, and that has, I think, reinforced our relationship. But let me go back and talk a little bit about the fundamental basis of our security relationship. And this really goes back, well, first of all, this is a picture of the former Emperor Hirohito signing the new Constitution of Japan in November 1946. And this was, of course, occurred during a period when Japan was occupied by U.S. forces as a result of having suffered a defeat at the end of the war. The American occupying forces thought it was very important to modernize Japan's constitution, to de-emphasize the role of the military. And so the first draft of this constitution was written in English by American lawyers, and this was presented to Japanese counterparts, and then there was a bit of a back and forth. But finally there was an agreement as to the Japanese language Constitution that was signed in 1946. But one of the key and very unusual provisions of that Constitution is Article 9, which I've written up here. And essentially what it says is Japan will not maintain a military force, and it renounces the right of war as a way of solving international disputes. And at the time, it was very ideal language that was drafted, but that has one of the things that's really influenced the sort of security relationship that we have. And the foundation of our relationship really is the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And this is a picture of Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, who is the father-in-law of the present Prime Minister Abe, who is signing this agreement with President Eisenhower in January 1960. And this agreement, signed in 1960, has endured to the present day. And this is the longest lasting bilateral security treaty that since the Treaty of Westphalia. There's no other bilateral security. Now, we have NATO, which is a multilateral treaty, but this is the longest bilateral security treaty between any two nations in hundreds of years. And so you have to ask yourself, why has this treaty endured for so long? And my answer is, it's because both sides benefit from the treaty. We're not doing this because we're nice people. The Japanese aren't doing this because they like Americans. We're each doing this because it's in our mutual interest to continue the relationship. So the provisions of this treaty are every 10 years, either side could renounce the treaty if it so chooses, and the treaty has always been renewed because it's been in both sides' interest. Now, there are two key provisions of this treaty, and the reason I'm explaining this is it's very different from NATO, where NATO is a mutual treaty, where any one country that's attacked, the other nations are obligated to come to their defense. And this treaty doesn't say that. This treaty has two main clauses, Article 5, which says essentially that the United States has an obligation to defend Japan should Japan come under attack. But it's not a mutual treaty. We have an obligation to defend Japan. Japan's obligation, it comes in a very different form. Japan states that in order to promote regional peace and security, it will provide facilities for the United States to station forces in Japan. And then the key word is for a range of regional contingencies. So what that means is U.S. forces in Japan are not there solely to defend Japan. U.S. forces are in Japan for whatever we want them to do in Asia. And we saw this, for example, during the Vietnam War, when U.S. bases in Okinawa were used for B-52s to take off and bomb North Vietnam. This was very unpopular in Japan. They didn't like being a place where the U.S. could carry out attacks against North Vietnam. But our answer was, that's in the treaty. That's your obligation. And the Japanese government never questioned, even though it was very unpopular politically, they never questioned that we had the right to use U.S. forces in Japan for other contingencies. Of course, the big one today is defense of South Korea. And to be honest, the United States could not meet its obligations to defend South Korea were we not able to have access to U.S. bases in Japan, because U.S. bases in Japan are the key for the rear support for the U.S. Army that's based in North Korea. And we can go into more detail on that in the Q&A, but essentially this is a treaty where each side conveys a benefit to the other side, but the benefits are different. We defend Japan, and Japan allows us to have facilities for U.S. operations in the Asia-Pacific region. So now let me explain why this is important for the United States. And this is important, and I'll explain why that is a little bit later. But essentially the term we use when we are stationing forces abroad, we call that forward deployment. We have U.S. forces stationed in another country. And what is the reason? Why is that in our interest? And to be honest, our president asked that question as well. And many of the candidates for Democratic Party president, such as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, are asking the same question. Why are we having troops there? Why is that in our interest? And it's a good question. And so let me try and answer that question for you today. I think there are 6 reasons why our ability to station forces in Japan is in the interest of the United States. The first is that this is a tangible symbol of our commitment that enhances our influence with allies. We see that with Syria. When we withdraw U.S. forces, things happen, and our allies have to react in ways that we might not be in our interest. So having a presence is a symbol of our commitment and serves to reassure our allies. The second reason why having U.S. forces stationed abroad is it deters potential adversaries. We've not had an invasion of South Korea since the armistice was signed in 1952. The North Koreans invaded the South at a time when President Truman essentially said South Korea is not in our security interest. And so he mistakenly thought that meant the United States wouldn't react if he were to invade South Korea. So being not clear about our commitment has consequences, and being clear about our commitment does serve as a deterrent. The third reason I mentioned is it increases U.S. flexibility and freedom of action. I mentioned during the Vietnam War, but a much better and more recent example was after Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, which really devastated the Philippines. The U.S. response to aid our friends in the Philippines came mostly from U.S. forces based in Japan. And the reason for that is geography. The U.S. Navy was within a couple days sailing distance. The U.S. naval forces in Japan were within a couple days sailing distance from the Philippines. Had we had to stage that rescue operations from, say, San Diego, it would have taken much longer to sail across the Pacific and get to Japan. So we're able to do things that we couldn't do if we did not have access to U.S. bases in Japan. The fourth reason, it's to defend our interests in the region. And we have an interest in peace and stability in Asia. We want to have our ability to engage economically in the half of the world's population. And so our presence in Asia is an ability for us to defend our interests. And the fifth point is, this is, in a sense, playing the away game. We'd much rather defend the homeland from afar than we would to wait until we're attacked and have to defend our own territory. And then the last reason, which is actually very important for the military, is our presence in Japan enables us to train where we might have to fight, and it helps us increase our interoperability with our allies. So this is the answer to the question of why should we have U.S. forces in Asia or abroad. And really, it's a choice we have to make. Do we want to be an international power that's engaged in the region or not? And if the answer is no, then of course it doesn't make sense for us to have U.S. forces there. But so long as we decide it's in our interest to have a robust engagement in Asia, the ability to station forces in Japan is very important. Now let me just describe very briefly what I mean by a U.S. presence in Asia. Let me go back. So the U.S. Navy, this is the most important overseas bases for the United States Navy. We have what we call a carrier battle group, which is a U.S. Aircraft carrier and 16 support ships that are based in Japan. And in fact, of all of the aircraft carriers, we have 12 carriers in our fleet. 11 of them are home ported in the United States, places like San Diego, like Washington, like Newport News, Virginia. There's only one carrier based abroad, and that's the USS Ronald Reagan, which is home ported in Yokosuka, Japan. What that means is that the family members of the sailors live in Japan, and when the ship comes home, the sailors are able to be with their family members. For all of the other carriers, when they have missions in the Mediterranean or other places, they're away from their family, and they have to sail all the way back to the United States to bring the sailors back together with their families. So this is something that's very important for the United States. So on the right is a picture of Yokosuka Naval Base, which is a U.S. Navy and a Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force base. They're right next to each other, and they work together very closely. The bottom picture is a picture of the USS Essex and the Japanese ship Hyuga. And this is an example of how they work together in terms of doing some joint training and exercising. And in fact, the United States Navy really almost in this part of the world has become dependent on our partnership with Japan. Japan has excellent, for example, anti-submarine warfare capabilities and also demining capabilities. And when the U.S. carrier goes out, often it's Japanese forces that are protecting the carrier with their anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Air Force, we have two very large Air Force bases. One is at Kadena, which is in Okinawa, and the other one is up in Misawa, which is the closest U.S. military base to North Korea. And there's a reason why we're there. It's because of our access to that part of the world. So again, we do a lot of training and exercising with Japan. Japan is in the process of acquiring a very large fleet of F-35 aircraft, which is the new fighter jet that the United States Air Force is acquiring. And by having the same platform, we're able to share maintenance facilities and do other things that enable both of us to be stronger. For the Marine Corps, Okinawa, the southern islands of Okinawa are a very important part of our facility. The Marine Corps has three what they call Marine Expeditionary Forces. This is a unit of about 20,000 Marines. There are three in the world, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and one in Japan. So if you talk to anyone who served in the Marine Corps for a career, 25 or 30 years, the chances are better than 50-50 that they will have had a tour in Japan because it's such an important place for the United States Marines to stage and to work together with their Japanese counterparts. And then finally, the U.S. Army presence in Japan actually is rather small. And the reason for that is that the U.S. Army presence in Japan is basically a support operation, mostly logistic support, to support the U.S. Army that's in Korea. And their mission is to deter North Korea from trying again to unify the Korean Peninsula by force. So the picture on the left actually is the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Japan, General Harrison. And this was right after the earthquake tsunami that occurred in Japan in 2011. And many of the Marines, Army, Navy, and Air Force were deployed. We actually had 22,000 Americans, airmen, soldiers, and Marines who went to northern Japan to help the tsunami victims. And this was the general who was visiting a camp for the people who had been displaced because their homes were destroyed. And he was giving a high five to a little Japanese girl here. But also, Japan's contributions to our alliance are much more than furnishing facilities. Japan actually contributes quite a bit of what we call host nation support. And the idea is that Japan will pay the United States Treasury, if you will, to defer the cost of stationing U.S. forces abroad. Our present agreement with Japan is a 5-year agreement, and it provides for Japan to pay the United States $1.6 billion per year. And what that means is that Japan covers about 70% of the cost of the civilian labor force on the U.S. bases in Japan. Have any of you, I'm sure many of you have been to a U.S. base somewhere around the world, and one thing you'll notice there is the large number of civilian workers. And the reason for that is, to be honest, civilian workers are cheaper than uniform workers. It costs less money. You pay a salary and pay health insurance, but you're not having to do all the training and other sorts of things. And that's true in Japan, except the civilian workers in Japan are Japanese. There are 24,000 Japanese who work on U.S. bases, and 70% of their personnel costs are borne by the Japanese government. Japan also pays for about 70% of the utilities at U.S. bases. So family members of sailors, when they turn on their air conditioning, 70% of the electricity bill is paid by the Japanese taxpayer. So what this means is that if we were to withdraw from Japan, bring the U.S. forces back to the United States, and maintain that capability, it would cost the United States more money because we would start having to bear these costs of paying the base workers and utilities and so forth for this. Japan also, I mentioned furnishing facilities, but it's not only turning over land to us, but they actually spend a lot of money in upgrading our facilities. These are 3 pictures of the Iwakuni Marine Corps Air Station, which is in southwest Japan, 1996, 2007, 2013. And you can see the difference on the left. There was a single runway on land in 1996. In 2007, you see the same runway, but you can see all the landfill that the Japanese government is putting in. And then on the right, the new runway, which is a double runway, is totally on the landfill, and the old part of the base is used for housing and other facilities. Well, this project cost $12 billion, totally paid for by the Japanese government. So we didn't pay for anything of that upgrade of our facility. In fact, if you look today, 3 of the 4 largest military construction projects in the world, base realignment, are paid for by foreigners. 2 of them are paid for by the Japanese and 1 paid for by the Koreans. So it's actually pretty amazing to think about. And I don't have a picture here, but we also have a very important plan to move a lot of our Marine Corps presence from Japan to Guam. That will cost $8 billion, and Japan is paying for half of that cost. It's the first time in history that you have a foreign power paying for construction of a U.S. military base on U.S. soil. But also the last thing I want to mention about why Japan is such an important partner for us is Japan itself is a very capable security ally. Now, if you remember back to one of my early slides, I showed you the Japanese Constitution, which says Japan will not maintain a capacity to wage war. So you ask, well, how can they be a capable ally of the United States if they don't have a capacity to wage war? And the reason for that is over time, Japanese courts have interpreted the Constitution, and they interpreted the Constitution to say renouncing war doesn't renounce our right to self-defense. We still have the right to self-defense, and therefore we have the right to maintain forces to defend ourselves. So they don't have an army, they have a ground self-defense force. They don't have a navy, they have a maritime self-defense force. But de facto, the capability of their maritime self-defense force is quite strong, and it's an asset to the United States Navy to have that partner with us. This picture on the right is some Japanese Army forces, and can anyone guess where they're landing? They're obviously they've left a ship, and they're coming to the beach, but can anyone guess where they're landing? This is a training exercise. They are landing in California, at Camp Pendleton. They're training with the United States Marine Corps because what they have decided, the Army's mission had been to defend Japan from a massed Soviet attack of tanks on the northern part of Japan, and they sort of recognized that's a very unlikely mission for the Army. Their real mission is defending their maritime space, and so their Army, they've decided, needs to become more like the United States Marine Corps. And so they're very interested in learning from the United States Marine Corps the tactics, procedures, and strategies for how do you defend outlying islands, and how do you, if necessary, retake an outlying island that's been taken by the enemy. So they've started about 10 years ago training with the United States Marine Corps in Camp Pendleton. It's called Iron Fist. I actually attended the last Iron Fist exercise and talked with the U.S. Marine Corps general, and I essentially asked him, like, okay, you're hosting this big exercise. It's great for Japan. You're giving them a lot of training and exercise. Why is this good for you? And he said, someday if my Marines need to go somewhere and fight, we want to be fighting with allies. And this is training for them. And how do you work with someone who doesn't speak your language in coordinating with another person and having a shared mission? So what my officers are learning, he said, and my men are learning, is how do you work with an ally together to achieve a shared goal? And so he said, this is a very valuable training exercise for us as well as it is for the Japanese. But in the last 5 years, the Abe government has done a lot of things that make Japan an even more strong military partner for the United States. In 2013, they centralized national security policymaking, creating an office in the Prime Minister's office, very similar to the National Security Council in the United States. They published a national security strategy like the United States does, sort of outlining what their goals and objectives are. The reason the state secrets law was important is that enables us to trust Japan with sharing sensitive information because we know they will protect that information. and a variety of other things Japan has done that make Japan more capable of dealing with a military contingency and a stronger partner for us. Here you can see Japan's defense budget over time, and since the Abe government has come in, the trajectory is going up. Japan is spending more on its own defense. This slide now gets back to my point, when I mentioned that this security treaty we have with Japan is the longest bilateral security treaty since the Treaty of Westphalia. And you asked yourself, why is this? And one of my answers was because it's in our mutual interest. But I think maybe even more important is both publics, the United States public and the Japanese public, support the security alliance. We're both democracies, and fundamentally, without public support for our security alliance, it's not sustainable. And we're very fortunate that if you look at this survey, this is, I don't have the citation here, but it's Pew Research that does a survey of global attitudes. I think they do surveys in 26 countries. But one of the questions in Japan is their view on the Japan-US security alliance. And you can see it's between 70 and 80% positive in Japan, feeling that this is something that's important. And likewise, in the United States, somewhere between 70 and 80% of the American public has positive feelings about the US-Japan security alliance. Interestingly, they separately do, I don't have the data here, a survey of elites in both countries, and elite support for the alliance is higher than general public support. People who really think a lot about foreign policy understand why this alliance is important for both countries. Another aspect that we forget about sometimes is that Japan is a very capable diplomatic partner for the United States. I have a picture here of Prime Minister Abe addressing the United Nations. He comes to the United States every September to give a talk at the UN Security Council General Assembly. But getting back to this point I made about Japan and the United States having shared values, what that means is when Japan goes out and exercises its diplomacy, often it's doing things that are congruent with things that we want. A good example of that is Japan's relationship with India. Japan has really reached out to India and developed a very strong relationship. You've probably heard of, the Trump administration has this, what we call a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Have any of you heard that term before? The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. It's one of the cornerstones of the Trump administration policy. Well, that concept was coined by Prime Minister Abe 4 years before President Trump came to office. He talked about a free and open Indo-Pacific. And the point is that not only is the East Asia important, but also the Indian Ocean is important. And so, it makes sense that we have a shared idea that this is freedom of navigation in the Indian and Pacific Ocean is important to both of us because we're both maritime powers. So it's a good example of how we work together. If I can just give you one quick anecdote to illustrate how important Japan's diplomatic partnership is. As you're probably aware, in the United Nations Security Council, there are 15 members, 5 permanent, we're one of the permanent members, and 10 are elected to 2-year terms. Of those 10, 2 are elected from Asia. So occasionally, Japan is elected as one of the 2 Asian non-permanent members of the Security Council. And about 6 years ago, Japan was running to be the Asian choice for that year, and we were very supportive of their bid, although we didn't say that in public, because in the United Nations, sometimes our support is counterproductive in terms of getting votes, but we were quietly very supportive of Japan. And when they were chosen or elected by the UN membership, I went down to the bureau in the State Department that is responsible for managing UN relations, and they were having a party. And I asked them, I'm very glad you're having a party, but are you? And they said, Japan is our best friend in the United Nations. We work with them very well. And now that they're in the Security Council, for the next 2 years, we're going to have a wonderful partnership working together. And if it comes to things like North Korea sanctions, like dealing with Iran, like opposing some of the resolutions that are demonizing Israel, Japan has been standing with us in the United Nations. So the people who are responsible for our UN policy were thrilled that Japan was assuming a more prominent role for the next 2 years in the United Nations. That's just one example of how we work together so closely with Japan. And then just briefly, and then I do want to open things up for questions and answers, U.S. and Japan have a vibrant economic relationship. It's something that's very important, lots of trade and investment. I have briefly here some figures about Michigan and Japan. And if you're interested in seeing this, are any of you familiar with the East-West Center, which is an institution in Honolulu designed to promote Asia-U.S. relations. But they put out a publication called Japan Matters for America. And and if you go to if you just go online and Google Japan Matters for America or Asia Matters for America, you'll find this. But they have a lot of data which is broken out state by state of the impact of Japan-Michigan relations, Japan-North Carolina relations. And according to their figures, Michigan exports to Japan are $2.5 billion a year. This is export of goods, export of services, $846 million of exports to Japan. Job creation, Japanese have invested $2.9 billion in companies in Michigan, and this has direct employment led to almost 10,000 jobs created in Michigan. So there's quite a vibrant relationship between Michigan and Japan, and this goes state by state. You can look at almost any state in the United States and see quite a large relationship. Japan now is has the second largest stock of foreign direct investment in the United States. When I was in Tokyo, I was working in our economics section, and I asked a lot of Japanese companies, because our policy was to promote foreigners investing in the United States. We saw that as good for the American economy. But I would ask Japanese companies, what is it appealing to you about the United States? And they said it's very simple. Your population is growing, and your economy is growing faster than ours. So we're businesses. We're looking to make money, and we see the U.S. as a good place to invest. You have rule of law. You're a reliable partner, so it's very natural for us to come and look for investment opportunities in the United States. And I think that will continue. I must say that the most successful area in the United States that's been the most successful at attracting Japanese foreign direct investment has been the Southeast. States like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina. And I can go into that in the Q&A session if you want. But it's across the board. Japanese have invested in virtually every state in the United States. And the reason is because they see it as in their interest. They think we're a good place to invest. So it's been a wonderful opportunity. And likewise, the reverse has been true as well. American firms have invested a lot in Japan and make a lot of money here. I mentioned to you NBA basketball, but both for the NBA and for Major League Baseball, their biggest overseas market is Japan. You can watch on Japanese primetime television American and National League baseball games, and they have to pay a licensing fee in order to be able to broadcast that. If you go to Tokyo, you'll see a lot of people wearing Seattle Mariners and Texas Rangers baseball hats because they have Japanese players on their teams and they have fans in Japan. Entities like Disneyland, Hollywood Movies, these are all corporations that are making incredible amounts of money. I was once in Kyoto, or on the train on the way to Kyoto, and the Kyoto Tourism Agency was promoting tourism to Kyoto. You probably all have heard of Kyoto. It's the cultural capital, lots of old temples. But they had a sign saying, "Come to Kyoto after you visit Universal Studios." Because Universal Studios had just opened in Osaka, and it was incredibly popular. So they thought they would hook onto that and say, you can come to Kyoto at the same time as you go to Universal Studios. And it just showed me how much U.S. popular culture has become a part of Japanese way of life and how valuable our brands are. If you go to Tokyo, you'll of course see lots of brands, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Coca-Cola. These are all actually Japanese companies, but they're paying Hilton hotels. They're all paying licensing fees to the Americans who are providing them with the brand, but also some of the know-how of how to run those kind of businesses. So it's a very lucrative business. Licensing and franchising is a very lucrative business for the United States. Just one other example I'll give you is New York Life Insurance. They are big in Japan, and what they sell is dollar-denominated annuities. Japanese people who are worried about their retirement want to increase their return on investment, and Japanese interest rates are incredibly low. So putting your money in the bank gets you very, very little, almost nothing. And what New York Life did was they came in and said, we'll sell you an annuity at a very high interest rate in dollars. So the Japanese consumer takes on the exchange rate risk, but in exchange for that, they get a much higher return on their investment. They have sold over $10 billion worth of annuities to Japanese savers. And because New York Life's promise is, in the future, I'm going to pay you in dollars, all of that $10 billion is coming back to the United States and being invested, because New York Life wants dollar income, not yen income, because they don't want that exchange rate risk. So essentially, small mom and pop Japanese savers are financing investments that New York Life is making around the United States. And no one sees that as a Japanese investment because it's a New York Life that's bought the freight elevator or the company that's there, but it's really the Japanese savers that gave New York Life the capital to make these investments back in the United States. So it's another example of how our relationship is beneficial. The Japanese savers are getting a product they couldn't get otherwise, and we're getting the investments which are leading to more economic growth in our own economy. So this is just very briefly, I talked a little bit about Japanese greenfield investment. Obviously, automotive is huge, but many other areas as well are quite important. I'll just give you one other example near where I live in Washington, D.C., Cove Point, which is a facility on the Chesapeake Bay that converts gas to liquid natural gas for export. That plant is possible because of Japanese investment. This was a plant that was built in the 70s to import liquefied natural gas from Nigeria. So the ship comes in, the gas is liquefied, they had to make it into gas and then send it out in pipelines around the country. And the problem was, of course, we have a surplus of natural gas now. We don't need to import liquefied natural gas from Algeria. And so this plant was sitting idle. And with some Japanese investment, it's actually Dominion Power, a Virginia company that owns the plant. But essentially, these Japanese investors hooked up Dominion Power with Japanese companies that want to buy natural gas, and they want to diversify their risk. They'd much rather have American gas than gas that comes through the Persian Gulf. So they signed a 10-year supply contract, and with that contract, they got financing to convert this facility from an importing facility to an exporting facility. And so now you have a lot of natural gas that's produced in Pennsylvania. It comes through the same pipeline that was already there to the facility. The gas is liquefied, and then it goes in tankers through the Panama Canal to Japan and Korea. And all of this is possible. The county that hosts this facility, 60% of their tax, it's a very poor county, it's a rural county, 60% of their tax revenue comes from this plant. So for them, it's an incredibly, it's a small investment. It was about $8 billion, but it was very important to this county that they're able to host this facility. So it's a good example of how globalization and taking advantage of economic changes. We used to be a gas importer, now we're an exporter, and you had Japanese companies coming in, helping us convert our facilities so we can realize the potential of our production. So that's the end of my slideshow, but I just wanted to, again, to reiterate, Japan is an important partner for the United States. The reason our relationship is so strong and so vibrant is because of our shared values and shared interests. And the reason the United States has an interest in staying friends with Japan is because Japan itself is a powerful and influential country in Asia. And so if we want to be involved in Asia, it's important for us to have friends like Japan. So let me stop there, and I think we still have, about half an hour for questions and answers. I can't quite see you, but I think there's going to be someone, you're going to be, Stan, sorry, you're going to be recognizing people, and then I'll do my best to answer your question. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I think we have time for quite a few questions still. There's some mics circulating in the back, as always. I see hands going up already. Let me just ask one question to start off with. As everybody knows, nuclear weapons are a very sensitive topic in Japan. But Japan certainly has the technology and the scientists to make nuclear weapons. What would it take for them to go nuclear?
And Stan is correct. Japan has a very large nuclear power industry, and also Japan has quite a large stockpile of plutonium that's a byproduct of their civilian nuclear power industry. So should Japan choose to develop nuclear weapons, it would be probably a matter of months. There's not a technical barrier to them acquiring nuclear. The barriers are political. Because Japan is the only nation in the world that was the victim of a nuclear bombing in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, part of the Japanese psyche is we were the victims of nuclear weapons, and we never again want to see nuclear weapons used in war. And there's quite a very strong anti-nuclear movement in Japan. I think a second reason, barrier, if you will, is the alliance with the United States. The point we make to the Japanese is you don't need nuclear weapons because we provide you, it's called extended deterrence. We will provide you the extension of our nuclear deterrent to you, and so you don't need your own nuclear weapons program. When I was in the State Department, one of the things the Obama administration did, which I thought was very good, was essentially, rather than take our word for it, let's show you exactly what we do and what it takes to have a nuclear weapons program. And so we had 4 times a year what we called an extended deterrence dialogue. And we had these in places like Los Alamos, New Mexico, or in Seattle, the nuclear submarine base. And we would talk about our doctrine and our strategy and how Japan fit into that strategy. But then we would show them essentially how expensive it is. It's not just developing a nuclear weapon. You need a delivery system. You also need a doctrine. You need safeguards. So, for example, when we toured Los Alamos to the facility there, they got to talk to the physicists who were there doing the testing. We don't do testing of nuclear weapons, but there's a lot of testing through computer simulation, other things. And it costs a lot of money to maintain these facilities. We went to the nuclear sub-base up in Washington, and they actually toured. It was the USS Alabama. I was kind of interested as well. I'd never been on a nuclear sub before. And they went down and talked to the sailors who go on these deployments. And you realize it's not just having a weapon. It's actually having the facility. The whole point of a nuclear submarine is the sub leaves the base and no one knows where it is, including U.S. Navy, because the whole defense system is that it's hidden, so it can't be attacked. And the idea is if we were attacked, they could not destroy all the nuclear subs, and so there would be a certain retaliation, and therefore people don't attack us in the first place. That's the theory behind this. But the amount of training that these sailors undergo was pretty amazing. So I think part of the goal we had with the Japanese was for them to realize it's not just having a weapon, it's the whole system that you need in place, and it's incredibly expensive and not something that makes sense for them to duplicate. So I think the chances of Japan developing a nuclear weapon are extremely low because of these political barriers, not because of technical barriers. So thanks, a very good question, Stan.
Thank you. We have a question right there, the gentleman there, and then the next question after that, down here.
So, thank you very much for this.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you very much for this informative and entertaining description of the Japanese-American Love Fest. Is it possible there are any problems?
I would love to say no, it's not possible, there are no problems, but yes, there are. And one of the challenges, I think, to be frank, and by the way, I don't work for the State Department anymore, so I'm not speaking as a State Department official. I'm speaking as a retired official, so this is my personal opinion. But it's been the last 3 years, well, even further than that, have been challenging for Japan. Certainly, managing the transition from President Obama to President Trump was a challenge. The American trade policy toward Japan, imposing tariffs on steel exports on the pretext that Japanese steel exports were threatening American national security. It's odd because what that policy meant is steel prices went up, so it became more expensive to produce automobiles in the United States. And the Japanese were saying, like, we want to buy steel. We're producing autos here. We want to buy steel, but why are you forcing up our prices? That makes it harder for us to sell cars to American customers. So that was an issue. I must say that I think Prime Minister Abe, and that was that slide I showed you of their sort of, shaking hands. Prime Minister Abe has done a much better job than most world leaders, particularly world leaders of democracies, in managing his relationship with President Trump. I've heard some American Japan experts criticize Prime Minister Abe for being too subservient or too deferential. But my point is, Japan doesn't get a vote in our election. The United States to Japan is so important that they will deal with whoever is elected by us. They don't get to choose that person, so let's not blame Japan for trying to get along with our president. If you don't like our president, it's on us. We're the ones that elected him. It's not on Japan. And I think, in fairness, in general, President Trump is less unpopular in Japan than he is in Europe or Canada or Mexico. And polling bears that out. The Pew that does this annual survey, one of the questions is your degree of trust in the United States president. And the degree of trust has gone way down in the last 2 years because they're comparing their degree of trust for President former president. However, it's gone down less than it has in Germany or Mexico or Canada. And some of the reasons for that are some of the policies President Trump has adopted they like. You know, being tough on China, they actually like that policy. In fact, one of the criticisms many Japanese had of President Obama was he was too naive in thinking he could induce China to change through these dialogues and discussions. Being tough on North Korea and imposing tough sanctions, the Japanese love that policy. So for some aspects of President Trump's policy have actually been welcomed in Japan. That said, I think in general the degree of trust in the United States alliance is eroded somewhat. I think, for example, recent actions in Syria, most Japanese public doesn't pay attention to that, but foreign policy experts look at how do we treat our ally? How does the U.S. treat other allies? And part of their judgment is, okay, how might they treat us? And the whole point of having an alliance relationship, we're the bigger and stronger partner in the alliance relationship. So throughout the history of our alliance, there always has been anxiety in Japan that the bigger, stronger partner, the United States, will somehow decide it's no longer in our interest to be a partner and will turn away, and then they're stuck because they have built their defense establishment around our alliance. They don't have that option of walking away from us. They really don't. Plus, they're in a bad neighborhood. They have North Korea and China right there. So there's always been that anxiety. And one of the goals that Stan and I had when we were working in the foreign policy was to assure the Japanese that no, we're not going to walk away from you. That you are valuable to us. We're not doing this because we're nice people. We're doing this because it's also in our interest. And then we would also talk about shared values. We're both democracies. We want to promote economic development. That has become harder for American diplomats to say, frankly, in Japan. So I am concerned. But I must say, when you talk to some Japanese foreign policy experts, their concern is not an individual. It's not President Trump. Is the American public turning away from the traditional American role of being an engaged international player that's a force for good since World War II. And what some Japanese say is you could see this starting in the Obama administration with a retreat from American responsibility. So the concern they have is not that there was a president who was elected who doesn't support this. Is this a trend? Are American voters, America First resonates among American voters, and Japanese ask themselves, can we rely on, because the United States is a democracy, can we rely on the United States in 10 years, in 15 years, long after this president has left the scene? And that's an open question, I think, frankly. I don't have the answer to that either. When I was a diplomat, I would say, of course you can trust us, and of course, because we value a relationship too. But to be fair, I think it's a legitimate question that Japanese need to ask. And so there is a lot more concern about where is our alliance going in the future. So thank you for asking that question. It's really tough. On the economic side, I would say I'm more positive because I think the relationship between Japanese and American companies is mutually positive. And the last thing I should mention about our relationship is, and this is where you all come in, our people-to-people relationship is really important. I think Michigan has 15 sister city relationships with Japanese cities, and those kind of exchange programs that are promoted through these sorts of things, Rotary Exchange, there are various Japanese students come to the United States to go to college in places like University of Michigan. I have a good friend who is a college classmate of mine in Japan who went to Michigan State, and he just loved it there. He was a comparative literature student. So there's a lot of people-to-people exchange, and I think among people who've traveled in each other's country, there's very strong support for the relationship. So overall, I'm positive, but I think really the fundamental question is, what sort of a nation do we want to be, and do we want to continue to be a global leader, or are we willing to do sort of an America alone strategy of we're the biggest and toughest guy, and so we'll work out the best deal we can without regard to others? And I think it's an open question of what sort of, you see that in the Democratic debates. There are people on both sides of that debate running to oppose the president in the next election. So it's an open question in my view, and I wish I had a better answer for you. But anyway, thank you very much for that question. There was a question over here, I think. Oh, right here.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. Can you speak about the demographic crisis that Japan is having with its rapidly aging population, falling birth rate, and do you see any linkage to maybe a potential wave of political populism that may result as those demographics really start to bite and the Japanese elderly population do not have younger people to serve them?
Thank you for raising that, and it's true. And for those of you who, did you all hear the question? Okay, thanks. Okay, and you're right that Japan is facing a demographic challenge because the birth rate in Japan is quite low, and so if you look at the demographic profile, the percentage of people who are beyond normal working age, say post 65, is going to be growing rapidly, and the number of young people coming through the system to replace existing workers is lessening. The United States, actually, we have similar birth rates among U.S.-born citizens, but the way we answer the problem, at least until recently, is immigration. And immigration means more immigrants tend to be younger. Immigrants tend to have more children because it's a younger population, and so our aging of our society is occurring at a much slower rate than Japan's is. By the way, this problem is not unique to Japan. Taiwan, South Korea, and China all have the similar problem. In fact, I would argue that it's worse in China, and China is the first country in the world that will grow old before it grows rich. And at least countries like Japan or Taiwan or South Korea are wealthy countries, so they can deal with this. I think from an American perspective, this provides some opportunities. I used to brief American companies, and I said, if you are in a business that serves elderly people, this is a golden place for you. So if you're selling a savings product, an insurance product, a healthcare product, a leisure product, tourism, because older people have more time and they have more money. So if you're one of the biggest areas of interest right now in Japan is integrated resorts, which is the code word for casinos. And all of the big, they don't call it gambling, it's gaming is the term they use. But all of the big casinos in the United States are vying to come to Japan because it's a very lucrative market. And so those kind of businesses are doing very well. The reverse, though, is also true. I think because Japan is aging before the United States, they will develop new products and make mistakes, and we can learn from both. Because they are going to be facing, how do we care for our elderly with fewer workers? And I'm confident they will find ways of resolving some of those issues. They will make mistakes as well, and we can learn from both from the mistakes and from the good things they do. I was recently talking with a representative from the AARP. You're all familiar with AARP, right? Sure. And they were very interested in going to Japan, and their whole point is, what can we learn from other countries that are facing these demographic challenges? And they, for the same reason you mentioned, were interested in going to Japan. And I'm sure as they do some of their research, they're going to be funding some, I don't know if you call it research or studies of how are other countries coping, and are there things we can learn from that? So, but you're right, it is a challenge. One of the big issues for Japan, I think, in terms of demographics is, do we allow more immigration or not? And it's been very tough for Japan to agree to the sort of for the Japanese body politic to accept the degree of immigration that countries like the United States or others have had. But it is growing. Now the labor force in Japan is about 2% foreign born, which is up from like 0.1% maybe 20 years ago. It's mostly a lot of Chinese, but a lot of Vietnamese, people from Nepal, interesting. There's a large Nepalese community. And also then ethnic Japanese from Latin America, from Brazil and Peru, who are Japanese Peruvians, Japanese Brazilians who have the right to come. So you go to a Japanese factory and you will see a lot of foreign workers. If you go to Tokyo or any big city in Japan and visit a convenience store, likelihood is that person in the store will not be Japanese. He'll be a Chinese student who's studying and working 40 hours a week at a convenience store. So there are sort of backdoor immigration, but recently the Japanese government passed a law to allow more immigration. And a certain area that makes sense is, for example, Philippine healthcare providers, because the Philippines exports a lot of healthcare providers to the United States. It's a big industry in the Philippines. You go to nursing school, you get your degree, you come to the U.S. and work in a hospital. If any of you have been to a U.S. hospital, you've probably seen that. And the Philippines would love to be able to have Philippine healthcare workers go work in Japan. And they just opened a tiny window for the Philippines, but I think that will increase because Japanese business is saying we need these employees, we need these workers. So I'm confident that there's a challenge here, but that Japan will be able to meet the challenge. But also I'm confident that we'll be able to learn from some of their mistakes and hopefully from some of the new technologies they develop. Yes?
What about the chance for populism?
Oh, I'm sorry. The second question was about populism. Yeah, thank you for asking that. And I wish I was clairvoyant and could say that, but so far populism such as you see in Italy or in Turkey or if you want to say the United States, you said it, okay, or the UK for that matter with Brexit. You've not really seen that in Japan. And one reason I think is that there are fewer foreigners, so there isn't something to react to in the same way that Americans have reacted to immigration or others in, say, Italy or something have reacted. So I think that's a big part of it. But I can't say it will not happen. But I will say the history in Japan of new parties, like you had, say, in the UK with this Brexit party. It was a brand new party. It was created and rapidly got, say, 20% of the vote. The history in Japan of new parties that has not been positive. Usually they're kind of one election, they do win some votes, and then it gradually recedes, and the remaining Diet members end up joining an existing party in order to survive. So it hasn't been a very fertile ground. There's basically in Japan been a long-standing conservative party that has ruled all but about 3 years since 1950s. And then you have opposition parties that are a break on the conservative party from doing radical things that the population really doesn't want. But you really it's been hard for any other political party to gain a lot of traction. So I'll say it's unlikely that you'll have populism, but I don't want to say it's impossible, obviously. It's something that, but thank you for that question. Thanks for reminding me I had a second answer. Another question. Oh, okay, sorry.
Other question? Yeah? Two questions.
We have time for two more questions.
Is there one back there?
There's one over here.
Wait, there's one there first, and then where? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We certainly enjoyed the presentation. Is there any relationship to the admiral I served under?
First of all, thank you for your service in the United States Navy. He was my uncle.
He was your uncle.
And just one brief story about that. For those of you who don't know, Admiral Elmo R. Zumwalt was the Chief of Naval Operations in the Nixon administration, and prior to that, he served as the commander of U.S. Naval Forces in Vietnam. Were you in Vietnam by any chance?
Yes, I was.
Oh, well,
that's
again,
where I served with him.
Thank you for your service there. The one brief story I'll mention, he graduated from Annapolis in 1943 and was rushed out, as everyone was, he was rushed out to sea because there was such a demand for naval officers. And he served first up in, his first engagement with the Japanese was up in Kiska in Alaska, and then he came down to the Philippines. His ship was actually sunk off of Guadalcanal, and luckily he was a good swimmer. He swam 1.5 miles to shore because his ship was sunk. So he had a lot of experience in combat with the Japanese. And in 1973, when it turned out I was going to Japan as an exchange student, I was a little nervous telling him about this. I didn't quite know what he would say. He was a Navy captain in those days, and he was already an admiral in those days, but I called him up and mentioned him, I'm going to go to Japan for a year. And his reaction was, great. Japan is a good ally. We need more Americans who speak Japanese. And he kept trying to get me to join the Navy. So he said, the Navy needs people who speak good Japanese. But it was really interesting to me to talk to someone who had spent when I was that age, when he was my age then, he would have been fighting Japan, and now he was a huge supporter of our engagement with Japan. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Well, I actually have a question.
Oh, okay.
I'm glad to hear that there is a relationship. He was well respected when I was in the Navy. The question is, tell us a little bit about the Japanese citizen. What does their personal income look like? What's their life expectancy? How do they stack up against us in the States?
Okay, thank you. Just very briefly, Japan has an excellent health care system. They have national health insurance, so everyone has access to health care. And it's not surprising that longevity for Japanese women is the longest, life expectancy, is the longest in the world. And for Japanese men, I think it's number 3. And they spend less on health care as a percent of GDP than we do. So that'll tell you something about the Japanese healthcare system. In general, Japan is a very wealthy country. There's one of the challenges for them is, as mentioned, was the aging of society and how do they cope with a shrinking labor force and growing needs to care for elderly people. And so that's a challenge that they're going to be facing going forward. But I think in general, particularly In Japanese cities, there's a interest in engaging in the world. Japan recognizes they're a small percentage of the world population, and Japanese business is very dependent on international commerce and international engagement. So there's a real interest in engaging in the world. So as I said, I'd say the weakness in Japan has been language. Japanese is very distinct from all European languages, and it's challenging for a Japanese to learn a language like English or Spanish or French. So in general, the foreign language capability in Japan is quite low. There are some exceptions to that, of course, but that's been maybe one of the areas where Japan could do a little better job of working. So thank you for that question. We have time for one more question, I think, here.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, it's very heartening to see such a bitter enemy become a close partner and ally, and great if that can be expanded. But my question is, since the scuttling of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what's been the Japanese reaction to that, and how have they accommodated that change?
Okay, no, thank you very much. Are all you familiar with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or should I do a 30-second? Okay. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was a attempt in the Obama administration to sign a multilateral trade agreement among like-minded partners in the Asia-Pacific region. The reason for that was the World Trade Organization progress on trade liberalization had stalled because countries like India and China, who all get an equal vote, were stalling sort of improvement. So the idea was, well, let's just work with those who are willing to move ahead. And it was a grouping of 12 countries: United States, Canada, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Brunei. I think I might have gotten them all. And the idea was, let's go ahead with a much better multilateral trade agreement, and then other people can sign on when they're ready to do so. And so this was something that was very important for the United States. The improvements, of course, a lot of more access to what countries like Vietnam and Malaysia wanted was access to the US market. That was very valuable to them. But for many other countries, it was really agreeing on a higher standard agreement of international rules. So we had rules on things like intellectual property protection, on electronic commerce, because the WTO rules were written before e-commerce, transborder e-commerce was anyone even thought about. So issues like, do you have to store your data inside the country, or can you have centralized data storage? Things like that were all agreed on in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was an agreement that was agreed upon, but when President Trump came in, it hadn't been approved yet by Congress, and the second day in office, he said, we're not signing this. So the response from Japan was, they were hurt because they had already passed legislation in their diet to implement the agreement. And it was painful for them because they agreed to a lot of concessions in the area of agriculture. They were going to allow for more beef exports and more beef imports and more pork imports, more feed grain imports and other commodities, cherries and other things. And so they had already paid the political price, introducing legislation in their diet to liberalize their market, and now they weren't going to get the benefit because the U.S. had withdrawn from this. So what Japan decided was, we're going to go ahead without the U.S., but we hope the U.S. will join later. And for the first year of the Trump administration, the consistent message from Japan was, the door is open, we're going ahead, but we're not excluding you. Please come in, we'd love to have you back. And the answer always was, no, we don't do multilateral deals, we want a bilateral deal. And so finally, the 11 nations, the 12 minus the United States, went ahead and concluded their agreement. It's gone into force. And so now you have countries like Canada, Australia, who have enhanced access to Japan's agricultural market. Japan also concluded a free trade agreement with the European Union, and so they made similar agricultural concessions to the EU. So the challenge right now for the United States is two of our biggest exports to Japan were beef and pork. And the beef tariffs are quite high in Japan. I think it's 38%. And in the TPP, Japan had agreed to cut the tariff from 38 to 22%, but then over time, over 10 years, to keep reducing the tariff until it gets to zero. And so now what you have is United States trade negotiators who worked really hard to get this concession from Japan, and our competitors get the benefits, and we don't, because we chose to leave the agreement. So each year that this continues, it'll be harder and harder for American exporters of beef and pork. The main competitors are European. It's Denmark and the Netherlands. But again, they have similar concessions. So unless we get back to Japan, so right now we're in the process of negotiating a bilateral trade agreement with Japan, and Japan has agreed to make some agricultural concessions. So the best case scenario is that our competitors got a head start. That right now is the best case scenario. But I think Japan still hopes that someday we'll come back to this multilateral agreement. And the reason for that is strategic, that if you have countries in Asia in a multilateral agreement, that one of the sets of provisions in this agreement is disciplines on state-owned enterprises. Well, guess what? We don't have any. Japan doesn't have any. This was really a message to China. If you want to become part of the multilateral trading system, you need to discipline your state-owned enterprises so they don't take advantage of unfair access to government financing. It was easy for everyone to agree to that because we don't do that sort of a thing. But the point was to China, we're not excluding you. You're welcome to join this agreement, but you have to agree to these provisions of the agreement. And so we lost that sort of strategic edge that we have. Now what we're trying to do is to negotiate directly with China to get them to discipline these things. And I think that's going to be much harder to do, very frankly. So anyway, short answer to the question is Japan went ahead without us, but the door is open. And if some future U.S. government decides we want to come back in, I think we'll be welcome with open arms. So thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
So thank you, Ambassador, for that very fascinating and enriching information and talk on Japan. I guess I would just say we have the benefit of your expertise here as we move forward in the next election and the next years ahead. What should we look for? What are the sort of benchmarks on the U.S.-Japan relationship going forward that we should look at?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a huge believer. I really feel a debt to my father's generation for the things they did in the 1940s that really established a global system that allowed the United States to prosper. And my own personal view is I hope we will continue being a leader in doing those sorts of things. But in order to do that, we need an engaged American public telling our politicians that this is important. So I'm going to give you all some homework now, which is I hope you, by showing up here, obviously you're engaged and you're interested, so thank you for that. But I hope you'll continue in letting your elected officials know that foreign policy is important. It's not a remote thing that has no interest to us. It's something that directly affects all of us. And so that's the way I think we can sustain our leadership. I think we were lucky in that we had a generation of people who experienced World War II and were committed because of their personal experiences. But that generation has passed on. And so now we have a new generation of politicians who maybe need to be a little bit educated about the importance of foreign affairs in the world. So thank you for your support, and I hope you'll go out and convince others.